Welcome to Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. for the launch of our new exhibition, Ancient Faith, the Churches of Nagorno-Karabakh. Through this exhibition, we invite people around the world to explore the sacred spaces, Christian culture, and stories of the people who have lived and worshiped in Artsakh. We hope that our guests in the exhibition learn about these sites, in many cases, I'm guessing, for the first time, that they understand their history, learn about the people who live and worship in these places, come to appreciate their beauty, and especially understand the need to preserve these sites intact. Tragically, war and political conflict has put these sites at risk of alteration and even destruction. There was open conflict over this territory in 1994, and again, as you likely saw in the news, only 8 months ago. Sites were damaged, churches were damaged by direct missile fire. Refugees fled the area. Soldiers and citizens were killed. International observers are still trying to gain access to the sites to verify their condition and ensure their preservation. This very day, the sites that you will hear about today are at risk of disappearing in the fight over the future of the land where they were built. Cultural and religious sites are at risk. As you will see in this exhibit, this is not a political project. Rather, through the exhibition, we hope that people in America especially can appreciate these churches and monasteries and their preservation needs. We also hope that visitors to the exhibit learn more about the people connected to the churches through short video segments, to understand the way that they interact with the sites. These churches and monasteries are not simply beautiful and culturally important. They exist because of and have been maintained by people of faith. And that faith has sustained people, even through years of uncertainty and conflict. And now the ability of people to worship freely at these sites is inhibited. The story in the exhibition is not always pleasant, but it is an important story so that we can learn from each other to live together as a global community, neighbors together seeking peace and understanding, and even friendship with each other, even if we are separated physically by thousands of miles. Our next speaker is Professor Christina Maranci, who is the Arthur H. Dadian and Ara T. Oztemel Professor of Armenian Art and Architectural History, and also Chairman of the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Tufts University. She is the author of 3 books and more than 90 articles and essays, including an introduction to Armenian art published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Her 2015 monograph, Vigilant Powers, 3 Churches of Early Medieval Armenia, has won several awards. She has worked on issues of cultural heritage for over a decade, with a focus on the at-risk Armenian churches and monasteries in what is now Eastern Turkey. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Maranci.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks to the Museum of the Bible for hosting this event and for the beautiful show. I'm delighted to be with you here, and I also want to thank Father Shahe for a wonderful presentation about Artsakh and about its ancient faith. When I was invited to give a presentation, I thought it would be useful to speak from my perspective as a historian of medieval Armenian art, and more broadly as a historian of the art of the Christian East, because I think that what's at stake with the potential risks that the monuments face now is there are a lot of things that are at stake. And sometimes that isn't so clear if you're not absolutely immersed in the field. So just to give you a sense of the context, what you're looking at here is a map. This is with this border. This is the area that we are talking about that is at risk. So the dotted lines and then all around here. So all of this, apart from what's in orange at the moment, which is still part of the Republic of Artsakh, all of this part, these green and sort of light green areas are now transferred to Azerbaijan as per the November 2020 deal made with Russia. Now, what this means is not only the handover of acreage, but as Father Shahe already hinted at, the handover of many important Christian monuments. Some of those Father Shahe already discussed. You've heard about Dadivank and Amaras, and I want to mention a few more because I want to give you a sense not only of a loss of Christian monuments, but also a sense of the volume of that loss. So all around this purple area is what is being handed over. So what does that look like in terms of monuments? Well, it depends how you count monuments, but one estimation, which is a count of every tombstone, chapel, church, and monastery, is over 4,041 monuments in Artsakh. So we still have to subtract the area that is still under the control of Armenia, of the Republic of Artsakh, but that still leaves a great number of monuments that are in danger. If we were to look only at a single province of this area that is handed over, we would have a sense of what is at risk. And it includes not just buildings, that is stone buildings, but also inscriptions, sculpture, painting, and of course, everything that churches are, which is they are about faith and about history and about identity. If we take this region, which is again a region of Artsakh, of Nagorno-Karabakh that has been handed over, this map gives you a sense of all the main monasteries and churches that are in this region. And these are mostly medieval. So they mostly have a foundation date that might be 9th century, might be 5th century, might be 13th century, but belong to the pre-modern period. And so again, this is only one region that we're talking about. And if we were to put this into the form of words, this is what it would look like. You would have this many sites to be worried about. And that's kind of where we are as art historians of Armenian art. We're worried about this many sites. Again, Father Shahe spoke about a couple of these, and he showed some really gruesome examples of before and after photos of monuments. And that's in our minds as we think about what will happen to the Armenian churches. As an example, I want to show you a church that is called Tsitsernavank, which is in the region that has been transferred to Azerbaijan. Tsitsernavank is a 5th, 6th century basilica, and it is an early Christian basilica, a spacious one. If you are familiar with early Christian architecture, you know that the basilica was one of the earliest forms used for church architecture. And we see examples of basilicas everywhere, from the British Isles to Rome to the Christian East. the example of Tsitsernavank is striking because it is so well preserved. Aside from some periods of renovation, which it did undergo, it basically retains the contours of its 5th, 6th century form. Now, if you study something like early Christian Rome, you would think that an extremely unusual and precious thing, because if you go and you try to find a basilica of Rome that has retained its 5th century outlines or decoration, it would be a difficult task. But Tsitsernavank does that. It is a precious example of a surviving early Christian basilica. And so here you see the plan on the right, and you can see that it has a series of piers dividing the space into aisles and apse for the celebration of the Mass, and 2 side chambers. It's built with its technique that is typical of Armenian architecture. We call it rubble masonry. It might look, particularly in those bottom courses, like solid stone, but in fact, this is revetment. It's facing stone that is sandwiching a core of rubble and mortar. And throughout historical Armenian zones, you will see this technique formed, used, and exploited to create vaults and domes and really soaring spaces. And Tsitsernavank is a very good example of that. Tsitsernavank is interesting too, for many reasons, but one of them is what you see in this photo, which is the apse of the church, but above it is a gallery level. This is unusual, and it's been commented on by professors like Jean-Michel Thierry and Patrick Donabedian, who studied the church and noted how exceptional it was to have a gallery level, a tribune level above the area of the apse. And if you think about it from a theological point of view, to have anything above that most sacred zone is not just a kind of, it's an architectural anomaly, but you sort of hard to kind of theologically justify as well. It would be really important to study more carefully this monument for that reason. It would be important to do archaeological investigations as well. So the risks here in terms of losing this monument it's not just about what survives, it's about further investigation and the compromise or perhaps cancellation of any further investigation. And that investigation would illuminate ancient liturgical rites, it would illuminate theology, and it would illuminate something of the experience of an early Christian church, which again is a rare and precious thing. I'm just showing you another interior of the same church, Tsitsernavank. And this one, I've just downloaded this picture from the internet from a site called Monument Watch, but I'm showing it to you because if you look carefully, you can see that there is decoration in this church, some of which seems to retain its early Christian phase. If you keep your eyes peeled even more, you can see that there's some fresco, in this case, surrounding a cross. In fact, Tsitsernavank is covered in frescoes, and again, they haven't been carefully studied. Now we have software tools in order to recover images and in a way tease apart images that might look to the naked eye like they're unreadable or invisible. So that's another thing that for all of us who study Armenian art, we're worried about. It's not just the past of these churches, but it's the future and it's continued discovery. So I'm going to just go forward and look actually at another area. This is just to the north. So we're kind of traveling north in the inlands now handed over to the Azeris to the province of Karvajar. Again, I just want you to note here all the places that we are talking about. It's not just the famous places, it's some of the more modest chapels, but these were of course just as important for the communities that worshiped in them. Again, if we looked at this in a Word document, we would have to list all these chapels and tombstones and cemeteries. And and churches and monasteries. Father Shahe mentioned at the very bottom, this is Dadivank. Again, a tremendously important site now under the control of the Russian peacekeepers. This is an aerial view of the site to give you a sense of its tremendous natural beauty, which I believe has been beautifully captured also by the Museum of the Bible event, by the photographs. Dadivank is an extraordinary example of Armenian church architecture. It is characteristic in its geometric profiling, with the wonderful conical roof and the faceted drum that you see in the main church of the monastery. And the attention to that is very typical of Armenian architecture, that attention to the landscape and the setting of the architectural site in the landscape. And, you know, in this time of Zoom and not so much travel, it makes it even more wonderful to imagine how it would be to go to a place like Dadivank. I have had the good fortune to be there, and I hope that everybody listening will also have such good fortune. There is experiencing medieval church architecture is something that I think has to be done in person. It's very well to look at photographs and plans, but these churches and sites are very much about breathing in the air and seeing the church within its immediate landscape and viewing the landscape from the church. So that connection, which is an ancient connection between the architecture and its landscape, is very important. And for Armenian Christianity, that connection with the landscape goes back to 5th century literary traditions. It goes back to the conversion of Armenia to Christianity in the 4th century. So that's just a little, just to give you a sense of what it's not just an aesthetic connection between architecture and landscape, it's theological and Christological. Having said that, I wanted to show you, this is a plan of Dadivank, and what you see is the monastery within its sort of topographic lines. What's extraordinary about Dadivank is that it has retained many of its medieval monastic buildings, that is, refectories, libraries, monastic utilitarian buildings. And this is unusual for a medieval monastery. Generally, particularly if the monastery is in use, those monastic structures outside of the church are rebuilt and refurbished. But again, Dadivank has retained the kind of medieval monastic fabric, meaning it's an extraordinary example of a place where you can get a sense of medieval monastic life, of everyday life. Another really important reason for this church to be watched and cared for. Yet another reason is its archive of Armenian inscriptions. And I'm just showing you some of those inscriptions here in a couple of drawings. In fact, it's covered in Armenian inscriptions. And these are mostly donation inscriptions, that is, members of the community who have given something, whether it's land or whether it is vessels or whether it is curtains, to the church in return for the monks' prayers. Also, we find commemorative inscriptions that name a person who has died and who wishes to be remembered in the monks' prayers. Each one of these inscriptions requires careful scholarly attention. And in fact, the very drawings I'm showing you give you a sense of the careful scholarly attention this monastery has already received. Nonetheless, there's always more work to be done, and at the same time, we want to understand and respect the pleas that these inscriptions represent. That is, each one of them represents an individual who has asked, who's made a prayer, and so they each one, just like the crosses that you see carved into the wall, needs our attention and care. In addition to inscriptions, Dadivank also preserves fresco painting, and the fresco painting has recently been conserved, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of it here. So this is inside the main church, and you see an image of Christ on the right, the Virgin, Christ on the left, the Virgin on the right, and Saint Nicholas, an image of Saint Nicholas between them, and an angel to his right. Here's a better detail of Christ, showing him giving or handing over the gospel book to Saint Nicholas. This is, again, extraordinary to have an example of 13th century wall painting, and in this case, a style that shows connections to Byzantine wall painting. Another reason for us to study and care about the church. And then I just want to show you the last dimension of what's important about Dadivank, and that is its tremendous sculpted surfaces. This, you're looking at one of the porticos of the church. This is the west portal, and you can see some of the decoration that's very typical of the 13th century. In the 13th century, you see in Armenian art all over the historical territory of Armenia a tremendous interest in carving surfaces to resemble geometric patterns or lace. You can look, for example, here maybe and see some of that beautiful kind of lace work. We'll just go forward for a minute. And the most beautiful example of that are the kachkars, or carved cross stones of Dadivank. Kachkars, which literally means cross stone, is a type of carving practice that in fact is a UNESCO intangible heritage practice for Armenia. And kachkars exist from all over Armenian territory, and they're still made today. These are two beautiful examples from Dadivank showing kachkar carving really at its height in the 13th century. When you see how the sculptor has really dematerialized, if you like, the stone and turned it into this kind of carved, very delicate carved fretwork. Just to give you an example from the Republic of Armenia, this is the Khachkar of Pogos from the monastery of Goshavank, again in what is now the Republic of Armenia, from 1291. Similarly, the attention here is on surface design and on creating multiple layers and levels of surface. Here, we have to understand this not just as an aesthetic choice, but as a choice that shapes the way you understand the Khachkar itself and the cross. Khachkars were intended not just to be appreciated, but to be venerated, to be worshipped in front of. They were anointed. They held important power, and they still do. And the idea of meditating, praying before an object like this, in which you can kind of get lost, in which the complexity is immediately obvious and yet very hard to kind of tease out and to comprehend, perhaps an analogy for God. So this kind of aesthetic and also let's say worship practice come together in the Khachkars of the 13th century. And the two from Dadivank are really beautiful examples of this tradition. But there are Khachkars everywhere in Artsakh, and I'm just showing you a few examples that are out in the cold, but are also part of the same worship tradition. A very interesting Khachkar was discovered uh, not recently, but in the northern region of Karvajar at a monastery of Handapert. And you see it here along with the wonderful photographer Hrayr Kacherian, whose photographs are being used in this exhibition from the Museum of the Bible. This is an extraordinary khachkar, not only because, I mean, it's a beautiful example of a carving with the cross and with grapes, referring, of course, to the Eucharist and the blood of Christ, but also because of this little mother and child, or woman and child, down below the cross. And here's a detail, and you can see that the mother that is breastfeeding the child. This is an image that is very unusual for medieval Christian art. It might immediately remind one, though, of the Virgo lactans, which is an image of the breastfeeding virgin, which has its origins in Egypt, even in pagan Egypt, but then certainly also in Coptic iconography. In this case, it's not sure. We're not sure. There is a very good argument that this is actually not the Virgin and Child. There's no halo. She is not dressed in a kind of particularly glorifying way, nor is the child. So it could be that this is, in fact, as Hamlet Petrosian has argued compellingly, a mother with her deceased child, and that child is being remembered here in this khachkar. But I would say, alongside that, its position within the monastery would have meant that for anybody praying in that monastery, they would have been reminded, because of the Christian context, of the breastfeeding mother par excellence, that is the Virgin Mary. And here I'm showing you a 14th century manuscript of the Virgin Mary, an Armenian manuscript, where the Virgin is breastfeeding the Christ child. And to make very clear the liturgical meaning of this, very evident, we have the archangels holding out their chalices to this pair. And that theological connection between the milk of the Virgin Mary and the blood of Christ is made by early church fathers, and then also by Armenian mystics. So there's much to learn from Artsakh, and in a kind of very wide spectrum of areas of knowledge. And the worry, of course, as Father Shahe has already reminded us, is of the kinds of destruction that are happening right now, and also what has been destroyed in the past with Armenian monuments under the control of Azerbaijan. And this destruction, which it takes various forms, from complete erasure of a monument, as we saw in Father Shahe's presentation. It also takes the form of removing inscriptions that identify, and here you can see an effaced inscription identifying a monument as Armenian. It also takes the form of actually destroying sites, cemeteries, tombstones, and then reincorporating them into new buildings. And an example that is in the show is the Tsar School, which was made in around the 1950s. And it is made of, it's very gruesome. It's made of Armenian tombstones and inscriptions and sculpture. And these are just put in pieces along the walls of this school. And again, this is a documentation of all the places in the walls where these tombstones and inscriptions, really fragments, spoils of Armenian churches and cemeteries have been inserted. It's very difficult to imagine, having grown up in the United States and, going to school in a regular building, what it must have been like. This school is now, pretty much abandoned. What it must have been like to study in such surroundings. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but let me just see. These are some details of that of the school and of the spoliated fragments. I think that I won't say much more than to say that the region of Artsakh has received centuries of interest on the part of Armenian scholars. And here I'll go back all the way to the 15th century, and where we have a manuscript that it was actually made in Artsakh. And but it's not just the manuscripts that were made and repaired there. We have foundation inscriptions, we have academic documentation and engravings. So that's the good news. There's tremendous amounts of documentation to help us understand this region. But of course, there are always questions, new questions that we need to ask. And without the standing monuments, without those, all we can do is speculate. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that the study of medieval Armenian art is becoming more and more interesting, I would say, to scholars of medieval art and of Christian art. And I think that's only going to continue. On top of that, I think that the current conflict, if it's done anything, it's made people aware across the world of the fragility and the power and the importance of what might seem a little corner of the Christian world. There is so much that we have to learn, and the only hope is that that the monuments will stand in order for us to keep doing that work. And I just wanted to show you, maybe I'll end with just to say that in museum collections across the United States, we can find examples of objects from areas that are no longer under Armenian control, like this beautiful clerical vestment that's now in the Armenian Museum in Watertown, that actually tells us it was made for a church in Nakhchivan, which is now no longer under, it's church that's destroyed. And it is, so that this object is really the only trace we have left of that community that worshiped in the church. And this is a textile, a beautiful early modern textile. So I think with that, I'm going to close and just again thank the Museum of the Bible so much for this wonderful and important show. And I'm really excited about how much this will do to convey to people the importance of the fragile and beautiful tradition of Armenian Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh. So thank you so much.
Thank you again for joining us. If I could close briefly with the way we conclude the exhibition online with a quote from His Holiness Karakin II, the Supreme Patriarch and Catholicos of the Armenian Apostolic Church, where he, quote, calls on the rest of the world to bear witness, to pray for peace and justice, and perhaps even to go to see these churches themselves someday. I hope those are all fulfilled. Thank you for joining us.